G'day guys, welcome back to True Footy. In today's video, I'm going to do a video I did last year where I react to Cal Twomey's article about what happened on draft night. So Cal Twomey does a really good job. He did this last year and I think he's done it for a number of years now, where he shows us a behind the scenes look at everything that almost happened on particularly the first night of the draft. So we're talking about who clubs liked as alternatives for the picks they actually took and also some trades that almost happened. This article can be found just on the AFL website. If you like, I'll leave a link to it in the description of this video if you want to read it yourself. But in today's video, we're going to go through it together. So the article starts off by establishing that Sam Lawler was Richmond's favourite player, which I think we can infer naturally. However, it is confirmed here that they were considering Finn O'Sullivan, and they decided midweek, which I think must have been about 7 days before the draft, they decided on Sam Lawler. So this is another interesting tidbit. Once it became obvious that Lawler was the Tigers' man, North Melbourne's interest in splitting pick to wane. This is presumably because if they thought that Richmond were going to take Finn O'Sullivan, they were more keen to trade. Once it became somewhat clear to them that Finn O'Sullivan was going to get to North Melbourne, they didn't really have much interest in splitting pick 2. There's a little bit more elaboration on that further down. It also says no club tried to make an offer for Richmond's pick 1. The Roos had put the picks up for grabs at the right price during the trade and pick swaps window. They wanted O'Sullivan and had tracked him closely since he trained at Arden Street in the preseason. It says they held chats with Adelaide about sliding back to pick 4. So we did hear this in the lead up to the draft. We also heard Adelaide was going for Jagger Smith. I'm not sure if that's confirmed in this article. It says they held chats and the Crows put forward 3 future third round picks for the move. So it then says Adelaide had sounded out West Coast to use 3 future third rounders to swap for a future second rounder and attach that to pick 4. So doing the algebra on that, do the deal with West Coast and send West Coast future second and pick 4 to move up to pick 2. And it says, but it didn't tempt North. So this is presumably because North then felt they could get Finn O'Sullivan. It says the pick was also thrown up to Richmond in the lead up to the draft, but the Tigers weren't interested in bundling any first rounders together. Yeah, there was a lot of speculation, including by me, but not just me, that the most likely deal for pick 2 would have probably come from Richmond. We were hearing that Richmond were interested in having the top 2 picks in the draft, but as it turns out, Richmond were not interested at all. This is another interesting tidbit, and it actually confirms something that I did read on Big Footy, which you know is always 100% correct. However, I did read some time ago that North Melbourne actually really liked Sid Draper. So it says, had the Tigers taken O'Sullivan at pick 1, Sid Draper would have been the Roos man unless they traded it. So this is a little bit contradictory. I think we can assume that they probably would have been more serious about a trade, but then had a trade failed with Adelaide, North Melbourne probably would have just taken Sid Draper, if that makes sense. And it says that they also liked Alex Taru. So perhaps the interest from North Melbourne in Alex Taru was a little bit overblown. This paragraph is about how Carlton obviously had done its work in the trade period and traded a future first, future second, and a massive deal to get pick 3. It just simply says here that they also put that deal to North Melbourne for pick 2. Okay, so this part is interesting for 2 reasons. It says the Blues ranked Jagger Smith the best player in the draft and breathed a sigh of relief several days out from proceedings when it became clear there would be no swap between North Melbourne and Adelaide. This is interesting for 2 reasons. Carlton had been linked to Finn O'Sullivan consistently, and they kept their interest in Jagger Smith pretty quiet because I hadn't really seen any link up until that point. In fact, if you'd asked me, I would have thought maybe Sid Draper makes more sense for them. No, they like Jagger Smith. That is presumably who they traded up for. And again, like I said, the top 3 clubs all picked the first player on their list, presumably. What this also implies is that because there was no deal between North Melbourne and Adelaide, Carlton were able to get Jagger Smith. That suggests, and it's kind of implied by Twomey here, and Twomey actually confirms it here now that I read it properly, that the Crows probably would have taken Jagger Smith at pick 2. We did hear this a little bit right before the draft. I wasn't sure if it was true. Carlton had been linked publicly to moving up the board for O'Sullivan, and we're happy to let that narrative play out. There you go. So that was fake news, and they would have taken Harvey Langford as an alternative, and perhaps Draper as well. So this part is about Adelaide, and it says with coach Matthew Nicks and the club's recruiting team meeting O'Sullivan on Wednesday for a final catch-up. So that sounds like he was their ideal scenario. Obviously, he didn't get close, but now I'm a little confused because if Adelaide had traded up for North Melbourne's pick, would they have taken Jagger or would they have taken Finn O'Sullivan? I suppose we take it that it would have been Jagger Smith, and then maybe they were hoping Finn O'Sullivan got to 4. By then, it was obvious O'Sullivan would likely be unavailable, but they were preparations in case a trade did ensue with North. So again, I'm unsure really whether they would have taken Jagger Smith or Finn O'Sullivan if Adelaide had moved up. That's a little ambiguous. It says Draper edged out Langford as Melbourne sweated on Adelaide's call. So yeah, we had heard a little bit around that that Adelaide liked Harvey Langford as probably the next pick they would have taken had Draper not been there. It was a close choice between the two, and Melbourne really liked Langford. They got their man in the end, of course, and as Cal Twomey said pre-draft, Melbourne probably would have gone Alex Taru had Langford been off the board. Another little tidbit that says Adelaide rated Taru highly. I mean, I suppose that's not that juicy. I mean, he was considered a top 10 prospect, and it sounds like they liked a lot of players, Adelaide. And they would have been tempted to bid on Essendon's NGA Isaac Kako. The first time I've heard about Kako getting bid on at pick 4. Melbourne was hoping Langford would go through to them, but also like Taru. Taru would have become a demon if Langford had gotten to the Crows. Regarding Melbourne's picks, says deals were thrown up using picks 5 and 9, but the Demons worked during the trade period to secure Essendon's pick, meant they weren't going to bundle up again to make get higher. Yeah, I don't think that would have made a lot of sense if Melbourne had tried again to move up the order. Smiley's drafting by Richmond had looked to be one of the top 10 certainties, but if he hadn't gone at the Tigers pick 7, he likely would have gotten through to their next 2 picks, past St Kilda and Melbourne's selections. Richmond wasn't prepared to take that risk, or more accurately, risk another club swooping on one of St Kilda's picks and taking Smiley, and took him at 7. So there was a little bit of conjecture around St Kilda potentially trading pick 8 back. I think GWS was considered a contender to that with 15 and 16. So maybe they weren't worried about St Kilda taking Smiley, but, you know, perhaps somebody would have traded for that pick and taken him instead, which is interesting because I honestly thought Smiley to St Kilda made a mountain of sense. Yes, an entire mountain of sense. I really did think that was the ideal pick for St Kilda, but it sounds like he wasn't really on their radar at all. The Saints had options with their next 2 picks. Travalia was their bankable player. So yeah, that was, I think in his mock draft, he had Travalia taken first, and that is exactly the way it played out. So if St Kilda had to take one player, it presumably would have been Toby Travalia. Joe Berry and Xavier Lindsay in the next bracket for the Saints. So yeah, again, right before the draft, we started to hear that Joe Berry might be a bit of a contender for like the top 10 or 11 picks, and he was invited to the first night of the draft, which does imply that. So this is where North Melbourne got on the front foot. With Taru still there, the Roos offered their future first round pick, which was knocked back. So yeah, it was a bit ambiguous at the time when I think Riley Beveridge tweeted at the end of the first night that North Melbourne had offered their future first for every single pick after St Kilda's pick 8. So I did think, you know, was it Matt Whitlock the whole time they were going for? Or, you know, if St Kilda had said yes, would they have simply taken Alex Taru? Would Harry Armstrong have been a contender in any of that? Maybe, maybe not. It says the Roos had tried to deal with the Saints in the lead up to the draft. Fremantle had also done a temperature check on St Kilda with their 14 and 30. And then here it says the Giants also thought about it, but decided 2 is better than 1. Melbourne grabbed Lindsay ahead of Bo Allen and Berry at its second first selection. Good choice in my opinion. He is the best player of that group of 3. But again, another early link to Joe Berry, which was a little bit surprising at the time. The Saints began to offer up their future first round pick to the Tigers in an attempt to secure Berry. That might be the juiciest bit of information in this article so far. The Saints were willing to trade a future first to get Joe Berry. While on the clock with their first of their 2 picks in the teens, the Tigers were fielding multiple offers. This is where it says North Melbourne's future first rounder with Harry Armstrong and Matt Whitlock still available. So I wonder if their preference went Taru and then went Armstrong, and then when he was gone, it became Matt Whitlock after that. St Kilda's first rounder as the Saints eyed Berry, a Gold Coast future first round pick with the Suns having interest in Taj, Houghton, Berry and more. Jeez, Gold Coast Suns is so greedy. You got like 4 academy players next year. That's pretty audacious. So I'm surprised Gold Coast bothered because of, you know, their need for draft picks in next year's draft. So this would have been a big deal. The Swans put forward the 2 first rounders this year, which were 19 and 22 before the draft started anyway, plus their future first rounder, bearing in mind they have some academy talents next year, in exchange for the Tigers pick 12 and 2 later first rounders, so 12 and 23, 24, maybe. That's an interesting move. It says here, Jonty Fall and Joe Berry were among the players in Sydney's sights. I had Jonty Fall to the Swans in a previous mock draft, but that was in the 20s. I didn't think Jonty Fall would go that early. Now we're up to that middle of the first round trade between Port Adelaide and West Coast where Fremantle was involved. Freo offered picks 14 and 30 before the draft started for West Coast pick 12. While the Power had put forward 13 and 50. For the Eagles, they had Allen and Berry as their preferred targets, but could move back 1 pick with confidence that Allen would still be available because Port was desperate for Berry. And I suppose, you know, moving back 2 spots was too risky. I think there have always been that risk that Fremantle might have taken Bo Allen. It doesn't sound like he was ever their first choice, but if I was West Coast, I would have had the same thought. Oh shit, Fremantle's going to take Bo Allen. The Power ranked Berry slightly ahead of Murphy Reid and Jack Whitlock. Okay, so if Jack Whitlock was considered for Port Adelaide's first pick as a general contender, they'll be stoked he got to their second. They also tried to get to Melbourne's second selection. That's really interesting. With Berry still available, the Power jumped and did the deal, leaving Allen on the draft floor, shocked that the Eagles might be about to pass him. Had Berry and Reid been off the board, the Power would have likely traded back slightly, bunny hopping and picking up draft collateral until taking Jack Whitlock. So they'll be stoked that Jack Whitlock got to their second pick, and they'll be stoked they didn't trade up for Melbourne's pick 9 because Joe Berry made it to their pick anyway. Their trade of Houston for 13 and 29 ended up landing them Berry and Whitlock in the draft. Not a bad result, all things considered. It says Fremantle too got the player it had in its sights, Murphy Reid. That's interesting. So that implies that Murphy Reid was always their first choice. So I don't know. There was a lot of suggestion it was Joe Berry, and you'd imagine Bo Allen would have been a contender. Oh, that's interesting. The Dockers were restricted in their attempts to move picks as well, given the AFL stipulate you can't bring in picks they have already traded to a club in a return deal. So if you've traded out a pick, no matter how many picks it goes around, I think you can't get that draft pick back in the same trade period. I don't know why. That seems like such a dumb rule. I'm sure somebody smarter than me can explain that. But it meant they couldn't deal with Richmond. They'd already dealt those picks in the Shea Bolton deal. Freo selection had been seen as a possible buy-in moment for clubs. Essendon were interested. Gold Coast was keen to use any of its 3 future firsts to trade in. So yeah, I didn't realise Gold Coast were actively trying to get into this year's draft. And the Western Bulldogs and Sydney looked to get higher as well. The Giants had identified Ollie Hannaford and Harrison Oliver as their preferred players. This, I think, is kind of clear. Like, both of those players were taken before what they were expected. I think Ollie Hannaford should have gone that pick. I think he is a Jet. Harrison Oliver, I think that was quite early for a player of his type, but nonetheless, I think I'll back GWS in their judgment. West Coast too had gotten on the march about a trade, offering Hawthorn's future first round pick to buy back in, with Jobe Shanahan still available. So again, it's similar to Port Adelaide. Like, West Coast got Jobe Shanahan at their second pick anyway. So, they'll be very thankful that they didn't trade their future first, and Port Adelaide will be thankful they didn't trade up to pick 9. It says here the Western Bulldogs waited. If Cooper Hines had been snapped up by someone else, it is likely they would have strongly considered taking a trade deal. Geelong had floated interest in Richmond's selection 21. This is the pick that took Luke Trainor. The Bombers were also checked in to see if there was a chance of a move, but the Tigers weren't shifting, and they knew that with Sydney's interest in Luke Trainor, they had to take him at 21. If the Tigers had taken Totoli, Sydney would have grabbed Trainor. In the end, it was the other way around, naturally. Richmond also knew that Harry Armstrong was unlikely to be taken by Sydney, so opted to take Trainor first and hope Armstrong got through to their next pick. That is well done by Richmond. Now we're back to North Melbourne offering their future first. Obviously, as it got later in the draft, they wanted something back, and as we know, they got Richmond's future second. So Armstrong had been on their radar, while Matt Whitlock also remained on the board. This is interesting. The Roos offered GWS their future first round pick for the Giants' future first and 24, but the Giants were hell-bent on Cody Angove. Now, he was like the biggest bolter in this draft, and you would have thought they could have potentially got him later. I could be wrong. We can't really know that for sure. But they had discussed trading out the pick and taking a gamble on him in the 30s, but didn't want to do that. As an outsider who didn't really know, what the team's boards actually look like, this would have seemed like a safe bet if you'd asked me. The Swans mulled over picking Shanahan at 26, having had a gap between Fall and Trainor and the next group of tools, but went for Ned Bowman. I'm grateful for this. I'm very happy West Coast got Shanahan. As we know, North Melbourne swapped a future first round pick for the Tigers 27 and Richmond's future second round pick. So we know that that's likely to be probably around the same pick, 27 and 27, for whatever North Melbourne's first round pick is next year. The wheeling and non-dealing continued on day 2 as Richmond put up its first pick of the night for sale. This is where they took Thomas Sims. North tried again to get Jack Whitlock as well, offering 2 future second round picks as part of a deal, but the Tigers preferred to take Thomas Sims. That would have still been a good deal for Richmond to get 2 future seconds for essentially a current second round draft pick. Evidently, they like Thomas Sims more. So there you have it, guys. Another great article by Cal Twomey. A lot of insight there. A lot of new things that I learned in that. I am very grateful that my club didn't trade a future first round pick tied to Hawthorn to try and get Jobe Shanahan. That's one of the biggest takeaways from me. This one actually worked out quite well. And it sounds like, there were multiple cases of teams probably being happy they didn't do particular trades. But let me know in the comments what you found was the most interesting thing from that. Cal Twomey does a fantastic job. I look forward to his insights every year. His mock draft this year was sensational in terms of how accurate it was. I think he got the first 11 picks right. But this stuff to me is like reality TV. I love the draft and I love the intrigue and everything that happens behind the scenes. But let me know in the comments what you think, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.